On the western edge of Tianjin stands a 1,957-foot skyscraper. It was supposed to be one of the tallest, most luxurious skyscrapers on Earth. I'm talking a glass diamond at the top and designed to hold a swimming pool, an observation deck, and even a revolving restaurant. When it topped out in 2015, it was the 5th tallest building in the world. But then, the workers left a few months later, and in the decades since, the tower has had no tenants and no guests. It's now listed in Guinness as the tallest unoccupied building on Earth. This is Goldin Finance 117, and the reason it's empty starts long before the building was finished. First, we need to take a look at China's building boom. For about 15 years, roughly 2003 to 2018, China was in the middle of the largest building boom in human history. Since 2000, Chinese developers have put up roughly 1,575 skyscrapers, which is about 60% of every new tall building on the planet. And get this, in a single 3-year stretch from 2011 to 2013, China poured more cement than the United States used in the entire 20th century. Cities were competing to build higher and faster than each other. Inside that race, height was a kind of currency. A taller building signaled that the city was modernizing, that capital was flowing in, and that the local party officials shepherding the project had something to show for their time in office. A 2024 study in the Journal of Urban Economics looked at hundreds of these projects and found that local governments were selling off the land underneath them at an average of 40% below market rates. Those subsidies were strongest in smaller cities and suburban districts, and were highest where local leaders were trying to move up the ranks. 5 to 10 years later, those subsidized skyscrapers weren't doing much. The land around them wasn't getting more valuable. New businesses weren't showing up. In the end, these buildings had more to do with careers than actual economic growth. Goldin Finance 117 sat near the top of that pyramid. Tianjin had marked it as one of the city's 20 key projects. The tower was designed by a Hong Kong firm, P&T Group, engineered by Europe, and built by the same state-owned contractor behind Shanghai Tower and Ping An Finance Center. Its silhouette, which was slender, tapering, and planned to be capped with a glass crystal, earned it the nickname the walking stick. The construction began in 2008, and the plan was high-end offices at the base, a luxury hotel above, and at the very top, a glass crown with a swimming pool that would have been the highest in the world. And at that point, nothing looked wrong. The buildings were rising, the money was flowing, but the funding is where things started to go downhill. So, Chinese property development ran on a few key pillars. The first was land. After a tax reform in 1994, Beijing kept most of the country's tax revenue, leaving local governments to fund themselves by selling land. And it worked. From 2007 to 2020, they brought in about $8 trillion US. By 2019, nearly 40% of a typical city's revenue was coming from that one source. So for a city like Tianjin, balancing the budget meant selling more land, and the only way to keep selling more land was to keep building, because each new project drove up demand and made the next piece of land easier to sell. The second pillar, and this is where things get risky, was pre-sales. Developers were selling apartments before they were even built. Sometimes before construction had even started, so people would pay up front, which was most of the time the full price, then take out a mortgage and start paying interest on something that didn't physically exist yet. It was just a virtual model in a sales office, and developers would take that cash and use it to buy more land and start even more projects. And on paper, that money was supposed to be held in supervised accounts and set aside for the specific building it was meant to fund. In reality, it didn't work that way. The cash was often used for whatever the developer needed next. According to Nomura, more than half of developer funding was coming from these pre-sales. Buyers, without realizing it, were effectively unsecured creditors. So between 2026 and 2023, developers pre-sold about 20 billion square meters of housing, but only finished 12. That leaves roughly 100 million homes that were paid for in advance, but never completed. And that model is what kept the giants moving, like Evergrande, Country Garden, and Sunac. Each new building paid for the one after it. The whole structure ran on the assumption that prices would keep rising and the next round of buyers would always show up. But Goldin actually had a bit of a different problem. As a Hong Kong listed developer operating on the mainland, it didn't have the same access to pre-sales that the bigger players did. Inspections came first, sales came later. So Pan Zutong, Goldin's chairman, leaned on something else, which was using the company's own stock as collateral for loans, and then using those loans to fund the tower. By 2015, the company's asset-to-liability ratio had shrunk from about 4-to-1 in 2011 to nearly 1-to-1. At that point, the whole strategy was basically a bet that the share price would hold up, and that the tower would make sense once it opened. Spoiler alert, that share price didn't hold up. On June 12, 2015, the Shanghai Composite hit its peak. Within a month, about a third of the market's value was gone. Across Chinese equities, the total wipeout was somewhere between $3 and $5 trillion. Goldin's own shares had surged 411% in the months leading up to the crash, in a market where, according to regulators, just 20 investors held 98% of the stock. Then on May 21st, even before the broader collapse, Goldin's two listed companies dropped more than 50% in a single day, wiping out about $22 billion in value. Pan Zutong, who had been the fourth richest man in Asia and worth close to $30 billion just weeks earlier, lost an estimated $13 billion before the year was out. The tower kept rising for a few more months. On September 8, 2015, Goldin Finance 117 reached its full height at 596 meters, but by December, as the money dried up, the workers were gone. The contractor pulled its teams off-site, the exterior was still unfinished, the inside was just raw concrete. The elevators were only partly installed, and the diamond at the top was still a bare steel frame. For the next 5 years, the tower just sat there at full height in central Tianjin, while everything around it started to fall apart. In August 2020, Beijing stepped in with a policy called 3 Red Lines, which put strict limits on how much debt developers could take on. Within a year, 14 of China's 30 largest developers had already crossed at least one of those lines. Evergrande had crossed all 3. By the end of 2021, it had defaulted on more than $300 billion of debt, which was about 2% of China's entire GDP. And it didn't stop there. Country Garden, Kaiser, Fantasia, and Sunac followed. In July 2021, the central government stepped in and banned new buildings over 500 meters. And anything over 250 meters now needs special approval. And the officials who sign off on projects that don't follow the rules can be held accountable for life, even after they retire. Goldin Finance 117 was even specifically cited as one of the projects that showed why these rules were needed. And by that point, finishing the tower didn't really make economic sense. Estimates put the remaining cost at around $10 billion. The demand it was built for, which was high-end office space, had now largely disappeared. But fast forward, in April 2024, something unexpected happened. The Chinese government announced the project was restarting. Construction permits were handed to 2 government-backed firms, and the Goldin name is quietly being dropped. The initial contract for restarting the work is roughly $78 million, just for the initial phase of restarting construction. And fast forward again to January 2025. Tianjin's top officials met with executives from Site Group, China State Construction, and Cinda Asset Management to formalize a state-led takeover. And as of now, completion is being targeted for 2027. Economists and analysts who have looked at the project say the numbers still don't work. The tower isn't expected to generate enough return to justify the cost of finishing it. Several have described it as a confidence project, and something being completed less for economic reasons and more because leaving it unfinished was no longer politically acceptable. There's even a term on Chinese social media for developments like this, land way low, or rotten tall building. Goldin 117 is the largest of them. However, finishing it doesn't change what made it fail in the first place. Goldin 117 failed because Chinese development incentivized starting projects over finishing them. Cities were funding themselves through land sales, developers were taking on more and more debt, projects were being financed through pre-sales, and officials were rewarded for starting projects, not for whether they actually worked. But it's not just Goldin Finance 117. There are roughly 65 million empty homes across China, and the total cost of that is still being worked out. The IMF estimates that finishing all of China's unfinished housing alone could cost about 5.5% of its GDP every year for 4 years. So Goldin 117 may finally get its glass crown, but across the country, millions of those unfinished homes are still waiting. If you want more breakdowns of how massive projects like this actually get built and how they work behind the scenes, this channel is just for that. I'm Tristan, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.